Hi, everyone. Welcome to IDEATex Presents. We're very, very excited to have you and very, very excited for our event this evening. Welcome to From Climate Disaster to Regenerative Future. And it's a presentation and group discussion. So thank you so much for joining us on this Thursday evening from wherever you are. If you're joining us on YouTube, I got to ask, and I'm going to ask it again, please smash that subscribe button to stay in touch with us. If you're joining us on Facebook, please follow our IDEATE page and perhaps join our community group as well. Tonight, you're joining us on Facebook. I couldn't be more excited about tonight for many different reasons. We're going to have about a 40-minute presentation here, and then we're going to move over to Zoom for Q&A and a group discussion to really express ourselves and to activate ourselves to make this regenerative future happen. As questions come up, please write them in the YouTube and Facebook chat. We're monitoring them. We'll collect them for that Q&A that we'll do in Zoom. So we'll be on YouTube Live and Facebook Live for the next 40 or so minutes. We'll give you that link to move over to Zoom when the presentation is done, and we'll come together as a community and group to have Q&A and to discuss how to get energized. So thank you so much for joining us. For those of you that are new to IDEATE, IDEATE is accelerating ideas for a regenerative world. Since 2009, as a global community of over 2,000 members, we are inspired by our values and the Burning Man principles. We're a community of purpose-driven entrepreneurs, creatives, and humans coming together to co-create a new reality that works for everyone and for all life on this planet. My name is Kevin Blake, and I'm a co-lead of this IDEATE community. And IDEATex is our program of events to inform and inspire our community with speakers, conversations, interviews, and other experiences like this. I'm incredibly happy and grateful to introduce two good friends, mentors, and just brilliant human beings, Herman and Lisa. They are partners in life and work and passion for saving our planet. They have been beloved leaders in IDEATE for the past 7 years and are based in Silicon Valley, where they truly believe the solutions for climate change can follow those of technology. They both hold PhDs. They've co-founded their company, Enterprise Development Group. They're both published authors, and they frequently meet with leaders of nations and companies all across the globe. We are really, truly lucky to have them in our community and with us today, as we always learn from their wisdom and ignite from their energy. Herman and Lisa, take it away.
And here we are.
Yeah.
Wonderful to be with all of you. Thank you very much, Kevin, for a wonderful introduction.
And IDEATE has been so important in our lives as well. So we've learned, I think Kevin's saying IDEATE might have learned from us, but we have learned a lot from IDEATE. So we wanted to talk to you about welcome home. We're going to be talking about, often when we go to Playa, it's welcome home, and we're going to talk about our planet as welcome home. And we're going to talk about 3 parts of it today. So, and we might stop and just check in with you between parts. The first part is going to be, where do we come from? Before we start looking at our current moment and where we could go as innovators and what we could build together, we want to really understand our deep future and kind of know what we bring to this current moment. So we're going to go pretty far back in time and then bring back to our current moment of where are we now? And then let's look at what do we want to build together? And where we bring back to our current moment of where are we now? So where have we come from? What we're going to present comes from a science exhibit called The Walk Through Time. And it's a project I had worked on with many others. It was founded out of Hewlett-Packard, but lots of different nonprofit groups were working with it as well. It's a science exhibit that is the history of life on Earth, from the very first time that life emerged on the planet. And Dr. Sid Liebes had collected information over many, many years and put it together with he worked in HP labs, which is their really kind of elite, very forward-looking research labs. In the walk, every foot that you take, or every step that you walk is 1 million years. And we walk through about 4 billion years of the history of life on Earth. And so by the time we've been through a mile, we've kind of walked all the way up to us.
Well, so imagine that the planet has now been around for 1 billion years already. So 1,000 million years is when life began to emerge. And what was really interesting is, so it emerged about 700 million years into the existence of the planet, but about another 300 million years later, we started to see fermenters. So very early microorganisms that were able to actually take a molecule like CO2 and turn it into food, into parts of their bodies, and convert that, which was a fundamental sort of mechanism for life to initiate the relationship to the environment. What's going on here? There we go.
And so what happened is that life actually created this atmosphere that we have now. If you look at all of the other planets in our solar system, they all have a very similar composition in the atmosphere, and which is mostly carbon dioxide. And so it was those fermenters that Herman just talked about, is that they took the CO2 out of the air and they turned it into protein. They also gave off oxygen as the waste product. And so oxygen is how we have about 20% oxygen in our atmosphere. And we're the only planet in our solar system that has that. So life created that for us. And here we are now. This is about halfway through the time of life on Earth. So for not quite 2 billion years, life was still all single-celled organisms for all this time. So those were the fermenters and other single-celled organisms, and that were continuing to take in CO2 and give off oxygen, and they were drowning in their own waste. They were poisoning the atmosphere. And at this point, 90% of life died. So halfway through the history of life on Earth, when we were still single-celled, life almost disappeared. So we made it to 90% died. Out of the 10% that lived, I mean, we know it made it through, right? We're here. So 10% that lived, a lot of those cells hid inside, they got away from oxygen. They went into swamps and into the mud to get away from oxygen. They started to go inside other cells. So it was really the beginning as a solution to not dying off, is that they really began for the first time to create these more multicellular creatures. But it was a really small percent of that 10% that did something that had never happened on the planet before. They invented something new, and they invented their way out of trouble with something the planet had never seen, which is they took in, they were giving off this oxygen, and they learned to breathe it. That had never happened before. It was just poisonous to them. They just died in oxygen. They created this mechanism that they could take in oxygen. And the really cool thing about it is they got a burst of energy. They got so much more energy than what they could have gotten before, that for the very first time they could move. They could move on their own, so that rather than floating and drifting with the currents of water and going wherever the water went, they could swim upstream. And so they could do new things. So they saved themselves by inventing something completely new.
So innovation is a fundamental aspect of life. And one of the things that's really remarkable is that once this oxygenation, this capacity to actually turn oxygen into food, into energy began, that became basically our ancestors. Today, every living being has these microorganisms inside its cells. So we have billions of these mitochondria in our cells. They're making it possible for us to transform oxygen into energy.
And they have their own DNA. They don't have our DNA. They're the DNA that has evolved back from that time.
Take that in. It's like universe.
That's how we're breathing.
We are a universe of life ourselves. And speaking of universe of life, so we are now only 540 million years ago, right? So the planet has been around for, more than 4 billion years at that point. And we have the Cambrian explosion, where creatures began to be able to mineralize tissues that allowed, the creation of bones and structures that are quite familiar to us today. So that was about 540 million years ago. Then You want to talk a little bit about that?
We're picking just the walk, by the way, has about 90 panels as you walk through a mile. And we're picking the ones that we think are particularly important for our story today. So we're kind of amazed. We're thinking about this moment. So this was about 400 million years ago. So from 4 billion years into just 400, where life came out of the water. So we were all in the water until then. So if you think about it, your DNA went through all of that. Your DNA was alive. The DNA in you came from the very first DNA on the planet. It went parent, child, parent, child, parent, child, all the way to you for 4 billion years. So at some point when we were in the water, life began to come onto land. And just to think about what that moment was like, about here's the whole world you'd known was water world, and suddenly there's continents and there's land and there's whole new territories to spread out into and to innovate into whole new worlds.
And they had to learn to breathe air. They had to learn to, hold themselves up against gravity. Around 360 million years ago, with CO2 still quite high, plants grew very large. And that went on for about 70 million years, where these large trees, these large organic substances, when they died off, very often they got covered up before they were completely decomposed. And that became basically the source of our oil and coal today. Right? So it took 70 million years to produce what we've been pulling out for the last 200 or so. And then 65 million years ago, we had this big mass extinction. That was the 5th mass extinction, the last mass extinction before now. And you're all familiar with that one. But what was interesting there is that dinosaurs have been on this planet for 165 million years, and they went extinct at that point. On the other hand, these small little mammals that were nocturnal and hidden away from these big creatures, all of a sudden saw a niche. They sort of found a way. They survived the darkness from this mass extinction. And, another 60 million years later, we begin to see basically things that look a lot more like us. Right? And if you had imagined us just having taken this 1 mile walk in about the length of the white part of your toenail, humanity sort of from the Cro-Magnons to now is the time that we've been around in this long evolutionary journey that life on this planet has taken. So we wanted to kind of take you on this journey to give you a sense of context within which we now want to then move into this particular moment that we're all in, where we're facing the current climate crisis. But before we do that, let's go back to just a few fundamental learnings from this quick journey.
So one learning is that life transforms the earth, right? So we saw how life built this atmosphere, which we're transforming again, but kind of created it as we've known it, was created here by life.
And then after every extinction, it takes at least 10 million years of time for Earth to return to the kind of biodiversity that existed before the extinction. But it can take up to 100 million years. So an extinction is a radical shift, right? It's the end of a period of time where a particular kind of life form was around, and then it's gone. And then it takes Earth that 10 to 100 million years to kind of reconstitute living forms that look like something similar, at least in terms of diversity, to what existed before.
And as far as we know, on this planet, we are the only species that knows this story, right? So in terms of that DNA from the very beginning, every other species around now also has come from that very first DNA and made it through all the other extinctions, just as we did. But they don't really know this story. We're the species that can look at this. We've had the science. We can know where we came from. We can understand this story. And not only that, but we're the first generation of our species to know. When my father was born, they thought there was one galaxy. It was amazing. There was this Milky Way galaxy, and it was enormous, but they didn't really know all the stories that we know. We're the first species and the first generation of our species to know this story.
So take a deep breath. We're moving into the next stage now. Kevin, in case anybody has any particular note that we should know about, please let us know. Otherwise, we'll
any
move
thoughts
forward.
Or reactions?
Yeah.
Or else we'll keep going.
All right, so now we're going to shift into where are we in this current moment. And a lot of this is known, and we want to kind of bring it together in a narrative that mobilizes us all into the third part, which is going to be about what are the kind of actions that we now need to take. We rely in part on the Climate Reality Project, which is a phenomenal enterprise that is associated with Al Gore as well. And so you're going to see a few pieces of material from that background.
And some of the framing on this is that some of this is quite terrifying for us as we present it each time. It's a hard thing to present. And I think it's why we start with the idea that look at these single-celled organisms innovated their way out of extinction. And it just kind of makes you think, what could humans do? Can we do what these single-celled creatures do?
Well, it's actually an important point, Lisa, that you're making, which is that what we're going to see in the solution part of this conversation is that us actually understanding these single-celled organisms, us understanding life and how life comes about and what makes this Earth capable of supporting life is actually fundamental to many of the solutions that we now have to pursue. So
let's look at our current moment. And we're going to think like a planet. We're going to think as a large global system of what's happening on our planet, on Earth. And this was, I think, lots of people watching this you've just grown up with this picture, but there was a time where nobody had gotten off Earth to actually go back and look at it, that it was an amazing, life-changing picture to see this, because for the first time, humans didn't just see what was right next to them in their town, in their community, in their country, but they could actually see this whole planet and start to think like a planet.
So thinking about a planet.
So part of what we're experiencing right now is just to understand the basic mechanics of what we're facing, which is our radiation is coming from the sun. It gets into our atmosphere, it warms it. A lot of it will bounce up and radiate back into space, but the more CO2 we're putting into our atmosphere, the more of that radiation gets trapped. And so you can kind of see that blue line growing around it, that little envelope around the Earth. And so even if we change what we're doing, the Earth is still giving us more and more infrared radiation, which is heat radiation. And so the sun is going to continue to pour in heat. And as long as we're creating an atmosphere that traps it, it's going to continue to get hotter for us every day, every month, every year.
So we put into that very thin membrane of life, we put in about 152 million tons of man-made global warming pollutions every day, 24 hours a day, as if it were basically an open sewer, right? We just keep pushing it out. And what's really stunning is that the energy trapped by these man-made warming pollutants is now the equivalent of exploding 500,000 times per day a first generation atomic bomb. So 500,000 of these bombs. So imagine Hiroshima 500,000 times, 500,000 times every day, basically 5 Hiroshimas every second. So that's the amount of energy modern humanity 5 of those a second. And how do we do it?
We do it through absolutely everything. So this is everything in our day-to-day life, almost everything. We're starting to change some of it, but basically our whole way of living runs off of that Carboniferous era. You saw how many millions of years it took and how it was buried underground, and we've just been pulling it up in every way we can so that we have all of our industrial processes, our agriculture, our transportation, anything that moves. So all of our energy that we're using, landfill, and what's happening with our waste. So it is all taking that carbon that was buried underground, and we're putting it up into the air.
And so that has consequences. I was born in 1951. So the year before I was born, something radical happened. For millennia, probably about 3 million years, our atmosphere existed with a carbon content of between 170 parts per million and 300 parts per million. So it was steady. Nature had a way to kind of accommodate these kind of shifts for all these many millennia. Actually, throughout human history, the atmosphere had never been above 300 parts per million until 1950, where what Lisa just explained started to show its consequences. We had put in so much CO2 that since that time, we've broken through that ceiling. And today we are at about 400 417. And in May, we were at 417. By now, we're a little bit lower because it's summer. But we are adding about 2 to 2.5 parts per million every year with really currently no end in sight. And what that means is that we are now in an atmosphere that goes back 3 million years when the sea was about 50 feet higher than it is today, and the temperatures were, of course, much higher.
And no human has ever been alive. There's never been a human being with the carbon as high as it is now. And so we see what happens. We know that the CO2 goes up and the heat goes up. And so that each year it's going to projected to be, this is projected to be one of the hottest years on record.
So what's really troubling as well, since we're now moving into the troubling part of this conversation, is not only are we putting that CO2 into the atmosphere, but there's now a legacy load. CO2 is a very persistent molecule. It doesn't just come back. Once it's up there, it sits there unless something absorbs it actively, right? So even if all of us would start to drive electric cars, which of course have their own problems, think of how we produce the batteries, et cetera, or we would all have, solar energy, that 1,000 gigatons of legacy is still up in the air. That, coming back down from that 410, 20, wherever we're heading, parts per million is going to take active work.
So you'll hear some things that were about net zero or net neutral or carbon neutral. And I think what Herman just said is, but that's still there. And so carbon neutral just keeps us at the level where we are. So some of my favorite words recently have been carbon negative and carbon removal. And this is where it really hit home for us, is that just about 2 months ago or so, this was San Francisco at 10 o'clock in the morning, and then it just kept getting redder and redder through the day.
Our anniversary.
Yeah, it was. What a way to celebrate. The world's on fire. So I think we were on emails with a number of people from IDEATE and friends elsewhere, and the word that people were using most often was apocalyptic, and it really felt that way. And what was happening is because there were fires on all sides of us that had come from a lightning siege based on a tropical storm that came much farther north than it would usually come. And in fact, the whole West Coast was on fire. So from all the way down into Mexico, all through the West Coast of North America, up into British Columbia and Canada. And that in Oregon, which if for anyone who's, I don't know where people are coming from who are listening to this talk, but Oregon's the state right north of California. And so at that point, like 12%, what was it? 12% of the state's population were told to evacuate. 12% of the state. So that has just been unheard of. And in Los Angeles, it was 121 degrees Fahrenheit. Same thing in the Arctic, some of the warmest temperatures that had ever been recorded. So the warmest day on record in June, where it was 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius. So an author that we like, Carter Bays, says, stop thinking about this summer as the warmest in the last 125 years, but the coolest one in the next 125. So we saw, we saw that the graph that went up with all the CO2 going up toward the right and the red lines of temperature going up toward the right. And then it ends at 2020. Like, oh, look, it's the hottest year on record. Well, what about next year? What about the year after that? What about 2025, 2030? Where are we going with that? And can we imagine what those days are going to feel like?
So we've been talking about the atmosphere a lot, but really importantly, and we're right next to the ocean here at the moment, is of course the function of our oceans. And of all that CO2 that we just talked about, 1/3 of that is actually absorbed by the oceans. And the effect, of course, of that is that as oceans have to absorb all that CO2, they do something with it. It's a chemical process. And a lot of that CO2 gets converted into carbonic acid, which means that the oceans are actually acidifying. And as the oceans acidify, it has massive impacts on the calcification, on shellfish, on all the creatures of the oceans. And here's a a video we would like to share with you to kind of, you know, show you a little bit more.
And we're hoping you can hear it, so let us know if you can't.
And here it is. It's actually a video that was commissioned by Google. Google had asked us a number of artists. It was a very Burning Man-y kind of thing they did, is they asked a bunch of artists to take the data from IPCC, other kind of climate data, and create it as an impactful kind of short video. And here's the one about the oceans.
Every second breath we take comes from the ocean. But this won't be for much longer. We're in the process of killing 96% of ocean life. If we fail to act, what will happen to ocean life and to us? The oceans absorb around 30% of the carbon dioxide that is released into the atmosphere. This decreases our ocean's pH and acidifies them, which has deadly consequences for much of marine life. Shells and skeletons dissolve, and marine animals' physiology changes. In humans, even a tiny increase in blood acidity can cause seizures, coma, and even death. If we continue at this pace, by 2100, the oceans will be 170% more acidic. In just 30 years, we are expected to reach the tipping point for the future of the oceans. By increasing global temperatures, we are depleting oxygen in the oceans and suffocating all life forms. Do we want oceans that are empty of life and only filled with our garbage?
So, I think take a breath after that one. What we find is we can't just like go to a different slide after saying by the end of the century, we're going to have killed most of the life in the ocean. And then next slide. I mean, we really want to be able to take a breath and take this in and take the implications of this, because it's not what any of us ever intended, right? We've grown up, this is our world as we know it. We're doing the kinds of things that were expected, or you know, we're working hard, we're trying to create products or services or offerings or bring nice things to the world, we're trying to be good people, and we didn't really intend to kill off life in the ocean and many other species on land as well. It wasn't what we thought we were going to grow up and do.
So continuing to think about the oceans, remember those nuclear bombs, those Hiroshima's 5 a second, plus a little bit more. Basically those 5, the heat from those 5 is trapped in the ocean, right? So that's a really interesting piece of information, is that most of that heat that we generate actually is absorbed by the oceans. And at some level, thank God, because it would be unbearable, you know, what's going on with us on land. But here's another problem, is that, remember when she said every second breath you take comes from the ocean? Well, that oxygen is produced by phytoplankton, and we have already killed a significant amount of phytoplankton, and we're on track to actually, you know, continue down that track. So the oceans are fundamental to our survival, to the survival of life, and we really need to start to take that in a very significant way.
Well, and I think that we often are taught, well, that our oxygen's coming from the rainforest and from plants and forests, and that's true, but that half of it's coming from these phytoplankton.
So one more perspective to just sort of take another quick view back to say, what does the world actually look like when CO2 is at the levels that we're in, just so that we can understand how to use that information as we move then into the next stage of looking at solutions.
3 million years ago, when the Earth was 3 or 4 degrees warmer, the North was mostly ice-free. lot of the water that is now locked up in glaciers was in the ocean, which means that the global sea level was about 60 feet higher. According to Marine's calculations, this is how the eastern coast now locked up in glaciers was in the ocean, continues to which means that the global sea level will start moving inland as the ocean returns to places it covered long ago.
Yeah. Doesn't seem like much, but it gets you back to a time when you had shorelines that were 80 miles further inland.
Right.
3 million years ago is the last time the CO2 in the atmosphere was as high as it is today.
80 miles further inland.
Right.
Over 400 parts per million.
This is our window into our future.
So how come our present sea level isn't right here now?
The ice sheets are out of equilibrium with the atmosphere right now. The atmosphere is warming. We're adding more CO2 every year. You could think of them like a frozen lasagna you've put in a preheated oven. You know, and the oven is our atmosphere, warmer.
Okay.
And the ice sheets are melting. It's like the lasagna would slowly melt. And it takes a while.
So that's another important point to clarify, that there's something already baked in, right? We need to realize that there's a lag between what already is existing and the implications it has for us here. So when this section closed, is that the result of that we've talked about is that it brings a whole number of impacts, right? From political instability to water scarcity to ecosystem loss to actually the loss of our way of life. You know, the shift to climate refugees, infectious diseases. We're just experiencing that. You name it, right? And these are significant economic challenges. And it's actually that we're going to show you is a part of the key to shifting away from what we just talked to you about. The realization of the economic powers that this is an economic problem is actually fundamental to the kind of solutions that are beginning to become possible as we move forward. So to close this part of the conversation, the second part is that we wanted to show you, that's where we wanted to talk about the oceans quite a bit, is we typically think about the land and the atmosphere when we think about climate, but the oceans are also a fundamental, or maybe the most critical element of this interconnected ecosystem. And the other one is that, you know, because it's a persistent molecule, we put it up there, we have to engage in ways that bring it back down.
And if you think about that in terms of bringing it down, everything we do, anything that any of us does today that continues to use carbon and we put it up there, somebody's got to get it back down. So anything we do every day, the more we put up, the more we got to bring back down. So we're the first generation to know this story. And we're also the last generation to be able to do something about it.
So this is why we're engaging with you, right? So what are we going to do about this? How are we stepping into this shift, into this realization, realizing that it's up to us now to actually move into a very different way of being.
So any thoughts about that before we go to the next part?
Are there any, Kevin, are there any particularly important perspectives that we should quickly address? Otherwise, we'll just catch up when we get on Zoom in a minute.
Yeah, keep going. We'll catch up.
Great.
Okay.
So where are we going? So every day we get these stories, right? It fits in with what we just put out, but it's in the public eye.
So this is what we read in the papers.
Just the last month, right? These are all.
Yeah, and these are all in paper. These are not just like academic scientific journals. They're out there for everyone to read. The Arctic is in a death spiral. How much longer will it exist? The Greenland ice sheet has melted past the point of no return. There are people, the scientists are saying, no matter what we do, all of that Greenland ice is gone. And what's important
like
about that,
right?
yeah, it's the lasagna, it's already baked in. And so what happens is that ice that's over land is even more important because that's what contributes to the sea level rise. That's going into the water. So every one of those articles pretty much says at the very end, but there may still be time to act. If you look at this yellow text, there may still be time to act. Like they just tell you these worst things you could imagine. And is that really true? Do we still have time to act? Well, it would have been much better to act several decades back when we knew that this was coming. But maybe the next best time is right now, as soon as we can.
So what's happening is, I mentioned that earlier already. This, on the right-hand side, this just came out today. So wielding $9 trillion, investors warn firms like BP and BMW that they need to get real on climate change. That the investors are saying, don't pretend that everything is great and you're making huge profits, when at the same time you're creating these kind of significant problems that are going to come back to us as investors as significant, problems later on. The head of the Bank of England says, if you're a company and you do not focus on climate, you're going to go broke, you're going to go bankrupt. And the banks are getting together, and then there's this kind of realization that.
So I actually kind of like this story in a funny kind of way. So it's a Morgan Stanley report about stopping global warming is going to cost $50 trillion. But I'm part of the Silicon Valley culture, or IDEATE, Burning Man kind of culture, that says, all right, somebody's paying $50 trillion. Well, it's got to go to somebody for it to be creating solutions to that. Who are the solution creators who are going to get $50 trillion? And so, in fact, we see that if we think about the eras of our economy, that it looks like there is a whole new era that's being born. This yellow line at the right, the regenerative economy, that has at least $50 trillion in it. And it's similar to if you think of going from agricultural era to industrial era, and how much just the whole way of life changed, where life moved from the country to people living in the cities. Young people moved away from their families and found jobs in factories. Same thing with industrial to digital. We saw how whole new ways of life changed. And then to begin to imagine that it's an economy, but it's also a whole new era of that kind of magnitude, when how we do everything is going to get redefined.
One of the things that's interesting to me is that throughout human history, progress has been associated with technological advances. Everything from the wheel to the printing press to whatever, right, has pushed us, electricity, you name it, has pushed us forward in terms of sort of the emerging of a new civilizational condition for humanity. And the red line is basically nature putting a stop of it, right? After all these hundreds of years, nature says, wait a minute, there's an effect from what you have done to me. And so now we're being transformed not by technology, we're being transformed by nature itself again, right? Nature's coming back to us and saying, enough already. We do need to, and you'll see it in a minute, apply our technological mindset, our capacity to actually understand physics and history from the microorganisms and all that, and bring it forward. We need to apply our intelligence, but in an entirely different kind of way.
And pretty much the way we do everything is getting transformed, from how we're growing our food, how we're getting around, what we finance, how we make things, about healthcare, energy, what gets sold and how it gets sold. Just anything you can think of will get redefined.
And so now, thank goodness, with a lot of help from you, some of you who are on this call, we are going to have a leader who is actually behind this realization. We are going to have a leader who is aligned with the realities that we just talked to you about, and it has made it a full commitment to step into this, also from a political perspective, in a way that it seems very, very much more hopeful to us than just a few months ago.
So let's look at what some possibilities might be, because in IDEATE, it's all about ideating into this regenerative future.
And we call these moonshots because the beauty of a moonshot is that when Kennedy, sort of positioned that we're going to be at the end on the moon at the end of the decade in the 60s, nobody knew how to do it. It wasn't yet known, and that's what's required here. We know what our version of the moon is, and we don't yet quite know how to get there. But we need to commit to it, and we need to really get going on some very critical and interesting
And part of what we did at IDEATE when we were on Playa was the Moonshot Tea Lounge,
yes,
where people could come talk about their own moonshots. And we did it in the virtual IDEATE as well this year, where we had moonshot conversations.
Fantastic ideas.
Could really get to hear what people were passionate about, their own moonshots. So here it is again, that solar energy. But just to understand that we could get all of the energy that we need for a full year just coming through in a day.
In 1 hour.
1 hour? We can't see it, it's covered. So that just to understand how strong that solar energy is.
So a background to our moonshot thinking, Project Drawdown, profoundly also focused to by an ideator, Amanda Joy Ravenhill, is really a wonderful grid of places to put our efforts. Where can we do these moonshots in industry, around food and agriculture, around energy, all those kind of territories that are where they've identified really specific aspects of effort that can make a big difference. So I just suggest that as you begin to think about your moonshots, contemplate how to align yourselves with these kind of frameworks.
Yeah, 240 global companies have made a commitment already to go 100% renewable. Lots of names that we've heard of. Now, what we know is that 100% renewable that just means we're going to stop putting more carbon up there. It doesn't take out what we've already done, but it's at least a start to see that so many mainstream companies are thinking about it. And then Google as well. So we're going to give you a couple of big company examples, and then we'll go on to show you what some other smaller groups are doing.
Why companies are important is because they are the creators of the problem, right? They are the ones that have impacted us, and most of us are working for them or in them or in a relationship to them. We buy their products, etc. So understanding what they can do and them stepping into that responsibility is really fundamental to these moonshots.
And so this is where Google is saying that they've already been offsetting their carbon legacy, but they're going beyond that what they want to do by 2030 is be carbon free, which means not just being carbon positive and putting some carbon in the air and then somewhere paying to get trees planted or other kinds of offsets to take it out. They actually want to run everything in Google without using any carbon, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every single day of the year.
It's a huge challenge, actually, and it's a moonshot. They don't know yet quite how to, but they're going to do it. And actually, just today, this article came out in The Economist, another sort of version of the same commitment that Sundar Pichai made about Google's commitment to that. Then we've got Microsoft.
Who I think are really inspiring. So here's top leaders, right? The president, the CFO, the CEO of Microsoft. They're going to be, my favorite words, they're going to be carbon negative by 2030. They're going to offset all the historic emissions of the company from the very day one, from when it was founded in 1975. They will have offset all of those by 2050 or taken carbon out to match that by 2050. And they'll have this $1 billion carbon innovation fund. And again, it's because we don't know how to do these things. They're going to be looking for startups, looking for solutions, looking to other companies. Part of the way they're doing it is they're going to tax every department inside Microsoft on their own carbon emissions, which means they have to know their carbon footprint. So we don't know exactly our carbon footprint, and many of you may not know yours, but they're going to all get that awareness by having a tool to measure the carbon footprint.
So imagine your parent works for Microsoft and they just have to make the decision between, should I fly or should I take the train or should I just not go? And it's going to cost me. I have to pay a tax into that fund. And that consciousness that comes home, right? That person starts to think differently about their own carbon footprint.
And they're also creating solutions. So if you think about that yellow curve that was this $50 trillion yellow line of the new economy that's starting, so they're making some products into that. So just like the one on the left is just saying, well, Microsoft Cloud, if they're really the greenest cloud around, and you have a company and you're thinking about running your own data center or other kind of cloud services, but Microsoft is the greenest cloud there is, and it's being carbon negative, then you can choose that Microsoft Cloud to help your own carbon footprint. And then the same that they have a carbon footprint tool, that fourth article over to the right. And SAP as well is looking at a carbon accounting and carbon emissions accounting system so that people can tell what it is.
So a really important aspect about creating this ecosystem for the regenerative economy is that nobody knows. Back to the moonshot, right? Nobody knew exactly how to get there, but we needed to create alliances. We need to come together and create consortia where companies come together like Nike and Danone and Microsoft, Mercedes-Benz, to basically figure out how are we going to do that? How do we support each other to move into these kind of new practices? And Walmart's interesting.
Yeah, too. Walmart is also just came out. This is also, so much of this is just new the last year, the last few months. So here it is, the CEO of Walmart, Doug McMillon, saying, working with our supply chains and customers, NGOs and others, we hope to play a part in transforming the world's supply chains to be more regenerative. And Walmart has some of the world's largest supply chains and deepest supply chains. Regenerating means decarbonizing our operations and eliminating waste. The world must reduce, avoid, and remove greenhouse gas emissions. No longer is it enough to slow down climate change and protect what we have left. And then I thought that this was a really interesting example for a leader in a business to say, because he's talking about as a society, we're at an inflection point. If we don't act now, we may not have an opportunity to do something later.
I think that reflects on what you said earlier, that we are the last to do something about it. You know, they're starting to get it, and that's what we see in our clients with our businesses. So here's an interesting thing for us to sort of start to think for ourselves, right? So what these companies are starting to do is they identify the company's current carbon footprint. They determine what the legacy carbon footprint is, because they are realizing that we have to take responsibility for taking this stuff back down. They're communicating these.
It'd be interesting. It'd be like if we had to do that to figure out from the time you've been born, how much carbon have you put up into the air?
Right.
Or someone put up for you.
And then once you know it, communicate it, share it with your friends, share it with your critical stakeholders and say, so what are we going to do about it? Commit to specific actions, right? And then invest in the development and deployment of carbon capture solutions, research startups, et cetera. And speaking of startups, that's another piece of this regenerative economy. And guess what? Some of our ideators are the pioneers in that space, right? I already talked about Amanda and Project Drawdown. And here's Ryan Kushner, who just started together with the Rocky Mountain Institute, this new incubator for accelerating climate innovation projects. And it's a remarkable and very powerful incubator. Another ideator, Tenzin Selden, is involved in the plant, which is an absolutely, I think it's going to be maybe the world's most progressive ecosystem for innovation into this climate problem that we just talked about. They are finding really interesting support from foundations, from significant companies. And that's the Hudson River, right? That's right in near, it's near New York, right? New York is just down the way to the Hudson River. So, and then, the classic incubators are moving into it as well. This was today. Today we were in Europe via Zoom for the Net Zero Innovation
Waking
Day
up at
with
6 a.m. This started at 6 a.m. our time, but it was today.
It was remarkable. I mean, there were some extraordinary startups that are doing really, really hopeful kinds of things. And one of the European oil companies was there too, and they're investing $500 million into things that really are going to make, they're basically getting away from oil, right? Because they know that's not the future. Then go ahead.
So we had a group that was coming back when groups could come to Silicon Valley one of the last programs we did in January. They wanted to look at what were these new energy technologies. And it turns out that there were about 13 energy accelerators just in Silicon Valley. So there might be, many of you might be from other locations and know of them in your own location. One of the interesting groups was Air Miners, and they are actually a platform that collects companies that do carbon capture, carbon sequestration, and turning carbon into products. And so Opus 12 was one of the startups that's
another ideator.
Yeah. Natasha is with Opus 12, and they're actually taking carbon out of the air and fermenting it into biofuels. And Novo Nutrients, who is a colleague of ours that we'd worked with for years. Novo Nutrients is a startup that is also taking carbon out of the air using those fermenters back from the very first organisms that you saw in the Walk Through Time slides. One of the earliest life forms are still here. We still are fermenting things. And so they're taking carbon out of the air, using it, turning it into protein. That protein gets fed to fish and fish farms and ends up with farmed salmon. And it solves one of the problems with farmed fish, which is that you have to, the volume of small, tiny fish you have to fish out of the oceans is so much more exponentially higher than the salmon that ends up on the plate, that people don't like to have farmed. It's one of the reasons why not to have farmed fish. And they solve that problem.
Food from air.
And things that can be fermented as well is Air Vodka. So it's the Air Company. They're also one of the companies on Air Miners. We might just go through some of these quite quickly.
We have to go quickly, but this is an extraordinary, we just heard this guy yesterday, and he is remarkable. So please research carbon engineering. It's based on renewable energy. he has an incredible vision and is an extraordinary speaker. So find out what he's up to. Mycelium is a huge potential. These guys from HiveMind suggest that the right kind of blend of mycelium could sequester 1 gigaton of CO2 in a site the size of New York Central Park. So remember, there's 1,000 gigatons up there, but that's hopeful, right? If we can deploy mycelium in this kind of way and say, bring it down, right? Let's get those mushrooms moving and draw down that CO2. That's really a big thing. You all have probably seen Kiss the Ground, a remarkable and really important film that I suggest, if you haven't seen it, please do. This is a great contrast between the industrial agriculture and the emerging new agriculture, regenerative agriculture, where nature is re-engaged, where the CO2 is driven down into the ground to the root systems of plants. What's interesting about that kind of regenerative agriculture is that it's potentially very labor intensive to levels that are just really hard to compete with. You see these machines on the left-hand side. And so we see really cool developments also with very simple robots, autonomous robots that can really help in that regenerative.
For small scale farmers. And this was that was the startup that was in Watsonville that we heard present yesterday in a regenerative innovation.
Our favorite regenerative farming project, of course, is the mushroom farm. Some of you have already seen that. It's an extraordinary project with really extraordinary people. Also, Amanda is involved with that, another ideator. So,
Brian
go out there.
Brian Kushner
and
as well
yeah.
was there.
So
that's at Pescadero. It's across from Silicon Valley over the hills.
And speaking of Burning Man, why not make it beautiful?
Yeah, and so this is from Logi, which is actually something that Burning Man organization is doing. Logi is a land art generator initiative, and they're doing a competition at Fly Ranch. And so this is these were some winners from their competition in other places. And this was for solar energy and for wind and water and things that can also be public art and kind of playful. And then just, kind of capturing the spirit of the wind. So it shows the role of creatives and art, that it doesn't have to look just always like the engineering that we saw from carbon engineering. It can be beautiful.
And while we have been talking about sort of the economic aspect of it, of course, we're all familiar with the fact that we have a global awakening that's extremely hopeful. And I refer back to the upcoming administration. I think there's going to be a coming together of politics and youth activism and technological developments that are going to be very hopeful in producing the kind of world that we just talked about. And with that, we leave you with the fact and with the notion that life on our planet, as we've described, this 4.7 billion years of emergence and where we are in this moment depends on us. And so we welcome you into a conversation now that we're going to continue on Zoom amongst each other, so we can see each other and kind of take this background as an impetus for a conversation. Kevin.
Thank you. Wow, what a brilliant presentation to learn, to feel, and to be hopeful and energized about. So please join us in Zoom. There's the link right there. We will answer all of your questions. Please come with questions or post more questions in Facebook and YouTube chat threads. If you're feeling anything, if you're feeling sad, happy, worried, anxious, excited, empowered, come, we're here for you. Please come join us in a safe space to express them and get in action with others. So please click on that link and join us in Zoom. And please join us for future IDEATex events. We have a racial justice series that we're launching in the coming months. And Herman and Lisa will also be launching their new monthly virtual moonshot tea lounges to bring your biggest and boldest ideas to help change the world and learn how to make them happen. So please follow that link and join us over on Zoom right now. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Two people in the waiting room. There we go.
Yeah.
Nick Farr, Jazz. Cool.